All right. I hope you're settled in and feeling cozy. Tonight, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to leave the vastness of space behind and take a quiet trip back in time to a specific place on our own world. We're going to tell the story of the Roswell Incident. Now, I know when you hear that name, your mind probably jumps to images of flying saucers, shadowy government agents, and alien autopsies. But that's not the story we're going to tell tonight. This isn't going to be a sensational, spooky tale. Instead, I want to treat this as a piece of American folklore, a quiet desert story that started small and, over many decades, grew into one of the most powerful and enduring myths of our time. We'll explore what happened, what people said happened, and why this one particular story has captured our imagination so completely. We'll approach it not as a frantic mystery to be solved, but as a fascinating piece of history to be calmly considered. The goal here isn't to convince you of anything, but just to lay out the story, with all its strange turns and quiet details, and let your mind drift with it as you relax and fall asleep. So let's start at the beginning. To understand the story of Roswell, you have to understand the world as it was in the summer of 1947. The Second World War had ended just 2 years earlier. The world was catching its breath, but a new, quiet tension was already beginning to build. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was in its infancy. The atomic age had begun, and with it came a new kind of awe and a new kind of fear. Technology was advancing at a bewildering speed, and the sky, which had once been the sole domain of birds and clouds, was now full of new, fast-moving, and often top-secret machines. This brings us to the place, Roswell, New Mexico. In 1947, Roswell was a small, quiet, fairly unremarkable town in the high desert. It was a place defined by vast, empty landscapes, scorching summer heat, and a sky so big and clear it felt like you could see forever. It was a remote and isolated part of the country, but it was also, secretly, one of the most important military locations on the entire planet. Roswell was home to the Roswell Army Airfield, and specifically, it was the home of the 509th Bombardment Group. This wasn't just any squadron. This was the only military unit in the world at the time that was equipped with atomic bombs. These were the men and the planes that had dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 2 years earlier. The base was a place of extreme security and high stakes. The skies above New Mexico were constantly being used for top-secret weapons tests and advanced military projects, including the captured V-2 rockets from Germany that were being tested at the nearby White Sands Proving Ground. So the people living in this quiet corner of America were used to seeing strange things in the sky. But in the summer of 1947, something new was happening all across the country. It was the very beginning of the flying saucer craze. Just a few weeks before our story begins, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported seeing a series of 9 crescent-shaped objects flying at incredible speeds near Mount Rainier in Washington.
The newspapers reported his story, coining the term flying saucers, and it set off a nationwide wave of sightings and excitement. The public was primed, looking to the skies with a new sense of wonder and a little bit of unease. It was into this superheated atmosphere of secrecy and saucer fever that our story falls.
Our story proper begins not at the military base, but on a remote sheep and cattle ranch about 75 miles northwest of Roswell. The ranch was managed by a foreman named W. Brazel, though everyone just called him Mac. Mac Brazel was, by all accounts, a straightforward, down-to-earth kind of guy. He was not known for telling tall tales. His life was a quiet routine of mending fences, checking on livestock, and keeping an eye on the weather over the vast, empty plains. On the night of July 4th, 1947, a powerful and violent thunderstorm raged across the region. Mac and his family heard a loud, strange explosion during the storm, but they didn't think too much of it at the time. Thunder can do strange things in the desert. The next day, July 5th, Mac and a young boy who was staying with him were out riding on the ranch to check on the sheep. As they did, they came across something they had never seen before. Scattered across a huge area of the pasture, a field stretching for several hundred yards, was a strange collection of debris. It wasn't a single crashed object, but a field of lightweight, scattered wreckage. Mac spent some time gathering up pieces of it. According to his original accounts, the debris was made of some very unusual materials. There were small, lightweight, wood-like beams, almost like balsa wood, that couldn't be burned or broken. There were pieces of a silvery, foil-like material. This stuff was the most peculiar. It was incredibly light, but also incredibly strong. You could crumple it up in your hand, and when you let go, it would unfold itself perfectly smooth, with no creases or wrinkles left behind.
Some of the I-beam pieces, Mac would later recall, had strange symbols on them. He described them as being like hieroglyphics, painted in shades of pink or purplish violet. They were symbols he had never seen before and couldn't recognize. He gathered up some of this strange material, stored it in a shed, and went about his work. He didn't think to report it for a couple of days. It was just a strange thing he'd found out in the middle of nowhere. A few days later, on July 7th, Mac drove into Roswell for supplies. While he was in town, he heard the flying saucer stories that were circulating around the country, and he figured he should probably tell someone about the strange wreckage he'd found. He went to see the local sheriff, a man named George Wilcox. Mac quietly showed the sheriff a piece of the debris he'd brought with him. Sheriff Wilcox, not knowing what to make of it, decided this was a matter for the military. He picked up the phone and made a call to the Roswell Army Airfield. The base commander, Colonel William Blanchard, took the report seriously. He ordered his base intelligence officer, a major named Jesse Marcel, to investigate. Marcel, along with another officer, followed Mac Brazel out to the remote ranch to see the debris field for himself. When Marcel arrived and saw the wreckage, he too was baffled. As the base's intelligence officer, he was familiar with all sorts of aircraft and experimental materials, but he had never seen anything like this before. The strange memory foil material in particular impressed him. He gathered up as much of the debris as he could fit into his vehicle and drove it back to the base, convinced that he had found something extraordinary.
Back at the Roswell base, Major Marcel showed the strange material to his commander, Colonel Blanchard. After examining it, Blanchard made a decisive and historic choice. He told his public relations officer, a first lieutenant named Walter Haut, to issue a press release. Haut typed it up and delivered it to the local radio stations and newspapers. The text of that press release is what officially lit the fuse on the Roswell legend. It was direct, official, and utterly stunning. It began, "The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office." Think about that for a moment. This wasn't some civilian UFO enthusiast claiming to have found something. This was the United States Army Air Forces, from its most elite, top-secret atomic bomb base, officially announcing to the world that they had captured a flying saucer. The story went out on the wire services immediately and became front-page news across the country and around the world. For a brief, incredible period on July 8, 1947, the Roswell Incident was real and it was official. But that period was very, very brief. The moment the story hit the national wires, the military's higher-ups realized they had a major problem on their hands. General Roger Ramey, the head of the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas, immediately got on the phone. Colonel Blanchard was ordered to send Major Marcel and the debris directly to his office in Fort Worth immediately. The story needed to be contained.
Jesse Marcel loaded the debris onto a B-29 bomber and flew it to Fort Worth. And it's here, in General Ramey's office, that the story takes its most crucial and contested turn. According to what Marcel would claim many years later, when he arrived, the real debris he had collected from the ranch was quickly taken away by some of the general's staff. A little while later, he was called into the general's office for a press conference. But the debris now laid out on the floor for the newspaper photographers was not what he had brought. Instead, it was the flimsy, torn-up remains of what was clearly a regular weather balloon and its radar reflector, made of rubber, balsa wood, and common tinfoil. This is the famous switcheroo that is central to the Roswell conspiracy theory. Marcel claimed he was ordered by the general to go along with the new story. So he posed for the cameras, holding up pieces of the balloon wreckage, looking, in the photos, somewhat awkward and dejected. General Ramey then told the press that the whole thing had been a mistake. The excited personnel at Roswell had simply misidentified a common weather balloon with its radar target, known as a Rawen target. He explained that these were used all the time to track weather at high altitudes. The press, for the most part, accepted the explanation. The next day, the newspapers that had blared headlines about a captured flying disc were now printing retractions. The Roswell Daily Record, for example, ran a new headline that read, "General Ramey empties Roswell saucer." The story was officially debunked. The excitement died down as quickly as it had flared up, and for the next 30 years, the Roswell Incident was almost completely forgotten, just a minor, slightly embarrassing footnote in the early history of the UFO craze.
And so we enter the second phase of our story, which is really a story of silence. From the late 1940s all the way through the 50s, the 60s, and most of the 70s, the world moved on. The flying saucer craze continued, with other famous sightings and cases taking center stage, but Roswell was not one of them. It was a non-story. Mac Bracel, the rancher, reportedly regretted ever reporting it, tired of the intense ridicule he received from his neighbors. The military personnel involved were transferred to other posts. The world entered the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the height of the Cold War. The story of a weather balloon in New Mexico was buried by time and history. The quiet lasted for 3 decades. Then, in the late 1970s, a few dedicated researchers, intrigued by old newspaper clippings, decided to see if there was more to the story. The key figure here was a man named Stanton Friedman. Friedman was a nuclear physicist by training, but he had become one of the most prominent and respected civilian ufologists in the world. He was convinced that some UFOs were extraterrestrial spacecraft and that governments were covering up the evidence. He came across the Roswell story and was intrigued by the fact that the original report had come from the military itself. In 1978, Friedman was tracking down people connected to old UFO cases, and he managed to find Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer who had first collected the debris. Marcel was now retired and living in Louisiana. When Friedman interviewed him, the story he told was not the one from the 1947 newspapers. The elderly Marcel insisted, with what seemed to be genuine conviction, that the material he found on that ranch was absolutely not a weather balloon. He described again the strange properties of the material: the metal foil that wouldn't crease, the beams that were as light as wood but couldn't be broken. He claimed that he had been forced by his superiors to pose with the faked balloon debris to kill the story, and that he had been ordered to never speak of it again.
This interview was the single spark that reignited the Roswell story. It was published in books and talked about at UFO conferences. It suggested that the original spectacular story had been true, and that there had been a massive government cover-up. This idea that the government was hiding something profound was perfectly suited to the mood of the late 1970s and 1980s, an era of widespread mistrust in official institutions. Inspired by Marcel's testimony, researchers like Friedman and authors like William Moore and Charles Berlitz started digging deeper. They began searching for other people who had been in Roswell in 1947, trying to find anyone who could corroborate Marcel's story or add new details. And as they did, a whole new wave of witnesses began to emerge. And their stories were far more dramatic than just strange debris. This is where the Roswell story grew from a tale about strange wreckage into a full-blown alien crash narrative. In the 1980s and early 1990s, dozens of people came forward with second-hand, third-hand, and often dramatic deathbed confession-style stories. One of the most famous of these new witnesses was a man named Glenn Dennis. In 1947, Dennis had been a young apprentice mortician working at a funeral home in Roswell. He claimed that on the day of the incident, he received several strange phone calls from the mortuary officer at the airbase asking about how to get small, hermetically sealed coffins and asking for advice on how to preserve bodies that had been exposed to the elements. Later, he said he went to the base hospital where he was threatened by military police and saw a nurse he knew who was in a state of distress. He claimed she later told him, in secret,
that she had participated in a preliminary autopsy of several small, non-human bodies that had been recovered from the crash.
Glenn Dennis's story, with its dramatic details of small caskets and a distressed nurse, added a powerful new element to the growing legend. It was one of the first accounts to explicitly introduce the idea of alien bodies, and soon others followed, each adding their own threads to the tapestry. Another key figure who emerged was a man named Frank Kaufman, who claimed to have been part of a civilian intelligence team at the Roswell base in 1947. His story was even more elaborate. Kaufman claimed that the debris field found by Mac Brazel was not the main event. He said that was just wreckage shed from a craft that had exploded in the air. He insisted there was another, second crash site much closer to Roswell, where the main body of the craft, a sleek, egg-shaped vehicle, had come down with its occupants inside. He described being part of a secret military team that cordoned off this area and retrieved both the craft and its small, non-human crew. His version of the story was filled with specific, compelling details, and for a time, he was a star witness in the Roswell research community. However, over the years, many researchers found significant inconsistencies in his accounts, and much of what he claimed has since been seriously disputed, even by many in the UFO community. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from one of the original participants, the man who started it all by issuing the press release. Walter Haut, the base's public relations officer, had for decades maintained that he had just followed orders and had no first-hand knowledge of the debris itself. However, he left behind a sealed affidavit with instructions that it only be opened after his death. When he passed away in 2005, the affidavit was released, and its contents were explosive. In this deathbed confession, Walter Haut claimed his previous statements had been a lie. He stated that he had not just seen the press release, but that he had been taken by the base commander, Colonel Blanchard, to a hangar where the object was being stored. He described seeing a metallic, egg-shaped craft about 12 to 15 feet long with no windows, wings, or tail. He also claimed to have seen at least 2 bodies covered by a tarp, describing them as being about the size of a 10-year-old child with unusually large heads. He said that the weather balloon story was a cover-up decided upon at a high-level staff meeting designed to take the intense press attention off the base. This affidavit seemed to be the ultimate confirmation for those who believed in the crash story. It was a first-hand account from a central figure, seemingly with nothing to lose by telling the truth at the end of his life. These stories from Marcel, Dennis, Kaufman, Haut, and dozens of others all layered on top of each other throughout the 1980s and 90s, creating the detailed, complex narrative that we now know as the Roswell myth. A flying saucer didn't just shed some debris, it crashed, and its alien crew was recovered by the military in a massive cover-up. This new, dramatic version of the story was perfectly suited for popular culture. Books on the subject, like The Roswell Incident, became bestsellers.
TV shows like Unsolved Mysteries broadcast the witness testimonies to millions, cementing the alien narrative in the public consciousness. Roswell transformed from a forgotten news story into arguably the most famous UFO case in history. And this media frenzy reached its absolute peak in 1995 with a strange, grainy, black and white piece of film.
In 1995, a British film producer named Ray Santilli released a 17-minute film that he claimed was authentic military footage from 1947, showing the autopsy of one of the aliens recovered from the Roswell crash. The alien autopsy film was a global phenomenon. It was broadcast on television networks all around the world. The footage was grainy and dramatic, showing doctors in contamination suits cutting into a strange, pot-bellied, large-headed humanoid creature with 6 fingers. The debate raged. Was this the smoking gun, the definitive proof, or was it an elaborate hoax? The creature looked strangely artificial to some, but the film's proponents insisted it was real. For a time, it was one of the biggest stories on the planet. Years later, the creators of the film finally admitted that it was, indeed, a fake. It was not original 1947 footage. They had hired a special effects artist to create the alien body and had filmed the autopsy themselves in a London apartment, painstakingly making it look like old, damaged footage. They cheekily claimed that their film was a reconstruction of real footage they had seen, but which had since degraded, a claim that has never been substantiated. The alien autopsy film was the high watermark of Roswell mania, a perfect example of how the story had grown from a simple report of strange debris on the ground into a full-blown cultural touchstone. The town of Roswell itself, which had for decades ignored its brief moment of fame, now embraced its new identity. Today, Roswell, New Mexico, is a major tourist destination for UFO enthusiasts. Its downtown streets are lined with alien-themed murals and lampposts. It's home to multiple UFO museums and research centers, and it hosts an annual UFO festival that attracts visitors from all over the world. The story that began with a rancher finding some strange foil on the ground has become the town's entire brand.
And so, we've seen how a quiet desert story from 1947 was resurrected 30 years later and grew into a powerful and complex modern myth, complete with multiple crash sites, alien bodies, deathbed confessions, and a massive government conspiracy. Now, let's take another gentle step down the iceberg. It's time to look at the other side of the story. As the Roswell myth grew in the 1980s and early 90s, the United States Air Force found itself under increasing public and political pressure to provide more answers. In response, they conducted a massive declassified search of their own archives to determine, once and for all, what really happened in the New Mexico desert in 1947. They released 2 comprehensive reports in the mid-1990s that provided an official and much less sensational explanation for the Roswell incident. So, let's begin our final chapter in this quiet story, not with witness testimony, but with declassified government documents. The first and most important explanation addresses the original debris found by Mac Brazel. The Air Force concluded that the wreckage was not from a weather balloon, at least not an ordinary one, but it also wasn't from an alien spacecraft. The debris was from a top-secret military program with a wonderfully evocative name, Project Mogul. Project Mogul was a highly classified program started right after World War II. Its purpose was to monitor the atmosphere for sound waves from Soviet atomic bomb tests. This was the very beginning of the Cold War, and the US was desperate to know if and when the Soviets would get the bomb. The idea behind Project Mogul was to fly long strings of high-altitude balloons equipped with extremely sensitive microphones and radio transmitters.
These balloons would float silently in a specific layer of the atmosphere where sound can travel for enormous distances. The hope was that they could detect the sound waves from a distant nuclear test on the other side of the world. Now, to track these high-altitude balloon trains, the military needed to be able to follow them on radar, and this is the key. To make the balloons visible to radar, they were equipped with radar reflectors. So what did one of these top-secret Project Mogul balloon arrays look like? It was a long train of neoprene weather balloons attached to several large, kite-like radar reflectors. These reflectors were built by a toy company and were made of lightweight balsa wood sticks and a special foil-backed paper. The whole thing was held together with strong tape, upon which were sometimes printed floral or geometric patterns, and it carried a package of scientific instruments, including sonobuoys. Now, let's compare that description to what Mac Brazel originally found on his ranch. He described lightweight balsa-like beams. He described a foil material that was strong and couldn't be creased. He described tape with strange purplish flower-like symbols on it. The match between the Project Mogul materials and the original 1947 debris description is striking, and according to the Air Force, explains everything found at the first debris field. The flying disc that the Roswell Army Airfield press release announced was, in all likelihood, the wreckage of a top-secret military spy balloon. This also explains why the military was so quick and so determined to shut the story down and substitute the much simpler, less classified weather balloon explanation. They didn't want the Soviets to know that we were trying to listen in on their secret weapons tests. The Project Mogul explanation provides a very compelling and much less exotic identity for the strange debris found on the Foster Ranch. But what about the other, more dramatic parts of the Roswell myth? What about the stories of the second crash site, the intact saucer, and, most importantly, the alien bodies? The Air Force reports addressed these as well. The investigation found no credible first-hand evidence from 1947 to support any claims of a second crash site or recovered bodies. All of those stories, as we've discussed, only began to emerge in the 1980s and 90s, decades after the event. The Air Force concluded that these later accounts were not intentional hoaxes, but were most likely the result of people misremembering and conflating different events over a long period of time. Specifically, they addressed the stories about bodies by pointing to another series of military projects that took place in the New Mexico desert not in 1947, but later in the 1950s. These were high-altitude parachute tests, like Project High Dive, where the Air Force dropped anthropomorphic dummies from balloons at extreme altitudes to test new parachute systems and study the effects of high-speed ejections. These crash test dummies were life-sized, bald, and had a somewhat uncanny, non-human appearance. They were dropped from planes and balloons all over the New Mexico desert for years. It is very likely that military retrieval teams had to recover these bodies from crash sites on multiple occasions.
The Air Force theory is that the witnesses who came forward decades later with stories of alien bodies were likely misremembering or combining a distant memory of the 1947 balloon story with a separate memory of seeing or hearing about the recovery of one of these crash test dummies from a different incident years later. Over 30 or 40 years, two separate strange events in the desert sky became merged into one grand dramatic narrative.
So we have two very different stories. One is a story of a crashed alien spacecraft and a vast government conspiracy to hide the truth. The other is a story of a top-secret military spy balloon, a mistaken identity, and the slow, complex process of how memory and folklore can transform a simple event into a powerful myth over many decades. Now, the goal of our quiet chat tonight isn't to tell you which story to believe. Instead, let's just sit with that question for a moment. Why has the Roswell story, particularly the alien version, had such enduring and powerful appeal? I think looking at this question tells us a lot about ourselves. This brings us to our final chapter, a quiet reflection on the psychology of a modern myth. One of the key factors, I think, is the genuine atmosphere of secrecy that existed during the Cold War. The government and the military were working on countless top-secret projects, from spy planes to nuclear weapons. They did often cover things up and put out misleading stories to protect national security. The Project Mogul explanation is itself a story of a cover-up. The military lied and said it was a weather balloon to hide the fact that it was a spy balloon. This atmosphere of real, justifiable secrecy naturally bred a deep mistrust of official explanations. It created a fertile ground for conspiracy theories to grow, because it seemed perfectly plausible that the government would lie about something as profound as finding an alien spacecraft. The lie about the weather balloon, ironically, made the much bigger story of an alien cover-up feel more believable to many.
Beyond the political atmosphere of the time, I think there's a deeper, more human reason for Roswell's enduring appeal, and that is our innate need for mystery and wonder. The 20th century was a time of incredible scientific advancement. We explained so much. We mapped the atom, we understood genetics, we were beginning to map the cosmos. But in all that rational explanation, some of the old magic can feel like it's been lost. The world can seem a little less enchanted. A story like Roswell pushes back against that. It suggests that despite all our science, there are still profound secrets just beyond our grasp. It hints that we are not alone in the universe, that we have been visited, and that the world is more mysterious and more wonderful than our everyday lives suggest. The UFO phenomenon as a whole, and Roswell as its most powerful story, filled a role in the modern world that was once filled by myths of gods, legends of fairies, or tales of monsters in the deep. It provided a sense of enchantment, a story that was bigger than us, a mystery that science couldn't easily explain away. And that is a very powerful and attractive idea. And then there is the most complex and perhaps most important factor of all, the one that is hardest to talk about because it involves no malice and no intention to deceive. And that is the simple, strange, and often unreliable nature of human memory. We tend to think of our memories as being like video recordings, stored away in a vault in our brains, ready to be played back perfectly. But decades of psychological research have shown us that this is not how memory works at all. Our memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. Every time we recall a memory, we are not just playing it back, we are actively rebuilding it. And in that process of rebuilding, the memory can be changed. It can be influenced by new information, by suggestions from others, by our own current beliefs and emotions. It is a creative and deeply fallible process.
Now, think about the witnesses of Roswell. The key figures, like Jesse Marcel, were first interviewed about the event more than 30 years after it happened. A lot can happen in 30 years. A memory of a strange, top-secret military material that you were told to forget can, over time, become conflated with all the flying saucer stories you've seen and heard in the intervening decades. Your own memory can start to feel more alien than it might have at the time, simply because that's the new context you have for it. And for the later witnesses who came forward in the 1980s and 90s, the time gap was even larger, 40 to 50 years. As we discussed, the Air Force explanation suggests that these witnesses, who were often completely sincere in their beliefs, were likely combining a distant memory of the 1947 balloon incident with separate, later memories of seeing or hearing about crash test dummies being recovered in the 1950s. Over decades, 2 or 3 different strange events that happened in the same general area can merge in our minds into a single, grand, dramatic narrative. This isn't to say that people were lying. It's just to acknowledge that our brains are natural storytellers. They like to connect dots and create coherent narratives out of confusing or incomplete information. The Roswell myth, with all its layers of bodies and multiple crash sites, might be a perfect example of a collective, slowly evolving story, with each new witness unintentionally adding a new layer, their own reconstructed memories influenced by the stories that came before. Finally, there's the simple power of a good story. A top-secret spy balloon crashing is interesting. A flying saucer crashing, with alien bodies and a massive government cover-up, is one of the greatest stories ever told. It has heroes, the brave witnesses, villains, the shadowy government agents, a profound secret, and huge stakes. As human beings, we're drawn to the better story. And the alien crash narrative is, without a doubt, a much better story.
And so, we've reached the end of our quiet exploration of the Roswell Incident. We've taken a long and winding journey together tonight. We started in the quiet, dusty landscape of post-war New Mexico, a place of secrets and big skies. We stood with a humble rancher, Mac Brazel, as he stumbled upon a field of strange, unearthly-looking debris. We felt the brief electric excitement as the local army base announced to the world that they had captured a flying saucer. And then we watched as that excitement was just as quickly extinguished by the official, mundane explanation of a weather balloon. We then jumped forward through 3 decades of silence, a time when the story was little more than a forgotten curiosity. We saw how a single interview with an elderly military officer, Jesse Marcel, provided the spark that reignited the embers of the story. We listened as a flood of new witnesses came forward, adding new, dramatic, and sometimes contradictory layers to the tale, transforming it from a story about strange debris into a full-blown narrative of a crashed alien craft with bodies. We watched as this new, grander version of the story was embraced by popular culture, becoming the most famous UFO case in history and defining the identity of a small New Mexico town. And then finally, we calmly looked at the declassified reports, the official explanations that spoke not of aliens, but of top-secret spy balloons and crash test dummies, projects born from the anxieties of the Cold War. And we sat with the quiet, complex nature of human memory and our innate love of a good mystery. The story of Roswell is, in the end, not one story, but two. And which one you find more compelling likely says more about you than it does about what actually fell on that ranch in 1947.
One story is a tale of extraterrestrial visitation and conspiracy. It's a story that suggests we are not alone in the universe, that incredible secrets are being kept from us, and that our reality is far more mysterious than it appears. It's a story that provides a sense of wonder, and for some, a sense of validation that their suspicions about the world are correct. It's a dramatic, exciting, and deeply alluring narrative. The other story is quieter, more complex, and more human. It's a story about a particular time and place, about the fears and secrets of the Cold War. It's a story about how well-meaning people, separated by decades from an event, can have memories that are flawed, malleable, and unintentionally creative. It's a story about how folklore is born in the modern age, how a simple, explainable event can be transformed by dedicated researchers, media attention, and our own collective desire for a good story into an enduring global myth. It's a story about us. As we end our journey tonight, the goal isn't to declare the case closed or to tell you what to believe. The goal is just to appreciate the story for what it is, a perfect case study in how we, as people, process the unknown. It's a reflection of our relationship with the government, with science, and with the vast, empty sky that has always been a source of both wonder and unease. So as you get ready to drift off, let the story settle. Think of the quiet desert landscape, the patient rancher, the earnest military men, the dedicated researchers, and the sincere witnesses. Whatever happened on that stormy night in July of 1947, it created a story that has rippled through our culture for over 75 years. It became a modern myth that tells us so much about our hopes, our fears, and our endless, deeply human search for meaning in a vast and quiet universe. Sweet dreams.